Good morning again. So good to be here with you today. Thanks again for coming out. Thank you for your invitation to have me here. I have been looking forward to this opportunity to share with you some of the things that I've studied over the last few months. This lesson that we're going to be talking about over the next few moments is special to me. You're going to get to learn a little bit more about me and who I am and kind of my life history a little bit. And one of the things I think as we go through this, I think you'll find as we get toward the end of this lesson, it will be one that's very relevant, very practical, and one that we can take out of here and apply in a very real way into our lives as we look and talk about modern culture. This lesson comes out of a series of lessons that we put together over the summer at Cornerstone. This was the lesson that kicked off our summer series back in June. And throughout the summer, we had men like Buddy Payne come in from FC. We had Ken Welliver. We had just a whole bunch of guys come in. Art Adams, I'm drawing blanks now. Don Truex, Andy Roberts, Roger Schaus, just a number of speakers that were with us on talking about engaging American culture in the 21st century. This was the first lesson to kick off that series, and I think it is one that will help you as you consider your life. So, looking back at me, I came of age during the 80s and the early 90s, growing up in a small town about halfway between Little Rock and Texarkana. Our little town was known as Malvern. It's still known as Malvern. It is the brick capital of the world. That's our claim to fame. We had 3 brick plants. And in fact, the clay there that they get is the only place you can make white brick anywhere on this side of the planet. And so there were a lot of white brick homes, not painted, naturally white. So it's kind of interesting that the brick capital of the world is where I grew up. It is still a close-knit community. And this is the house that I grew up in. We knew just about everybody on our street, and if a person didn't know who you were, then they almost certainly knew your parents. This is my mom and dad back in the early 80s. They were happy, and my dad's already gone home to his reward, but people knew who mom and dad were, or they knew your grandparents. This was my grandparents taken the night before we got married, my mom's mom and stepdad. And this was my grandmother on my dad's side. And everybody knew who you were. And if they didn't know your grandparents, then they knew probably somebody in your extended family. Just about everybody where I grew up was connected in some way. In the days before Walmart started selling groceries, I can remember going in the food center in my hometown where my uncle still works and see people stopped in the aisles asking about friends and family and catching up on life. And I can remember how people that grew up in my county spent their whole life there. And people moving into our county, it was a big deal. And sometimes when people would leave our county and move away, I can remember discussions in our family at least. We could never figure out why anybody would ever want to leave, because we thought it was the center of the universe and the best place to live. Our community was safe. I rode my bicycle all over town during the summer as a young boy growing up. I can remember fishing on the river with friends. I can remember floating in the flat bottom boat down the river outside of town and just being out in the woods with your 410 or your 22. It was just a part of life. That's what I remember. That's how I spent my youth growing up. That picture there of that bridge, that river bridge, that's just like the way I remember it. That bridge is gone now. It got washed away in a flood about 20 years ago. But it was a great place to grow up. There was a basic trust. There was an expectation among people in our town to do the right thing, to work hard, to be honest, and to treat people right. That's the way I was raised. And looking back in our town, most people were religious. This is a little congregation, the building out where I grew up, and most people were religious. Every parking lot of every church in town was just about full every Sunday morning. I'll tell you this, in the mid-'80s, it was a town scandal when Walmart opened on Sunday for the first time. That was a big deal. And because there was no store in town open on Sunday in the early 80s where I grew up. No one ever scheduled a school event or some kind of extracurricular event on a Wednesday night or a Sunday afternoon. That was church time. And everybody knew it. Christian influence was strong wherever you went. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in our community was perfect. We obviously had trouble. There were dishonest people. Here's Dad. Dad was a deputy sheriff back in the early 80s, and he could tell you all about dishonest and bad people in our county. There were lines at the liquor stores at the county line. There were broken marriages. There were abused kids. There was racism that reaped its ugly head every now and then. People went to jail, and churches had their squabbles. It was just real life. But looking back, it was a great place to grow up. And I'm part of who I am this day because of a lot of the people gathered together in that picture. This is probably in the mid-90s. I don't know if Becky and I were married yet. We're in the middle of the picture there. My dad's out on the side there. But this group of people, this group of Christians, really impacted me growing up. And it's part of who I am today because of that small group of about 30 or 40 people. Looking back, I miss a lot of that. But as you think about it, our world today is much different. The way of life that I remember growing up seems so much simpler, so much more innocent now. And really, for many of us, it's part of a world that's hard to recognize because we look around today and we see things that are totally different. Our past American culture seems to be slipping away in some ways. So many things have changed. And a lot of times we wonder how much further are things going to go as the world runs farther and farther away from God. We wonder what is going to happen when we are told that we must publicly affirm immorality. Why is it that our children are growing up thinking that our world is going to dissolve into a civil war over the next few years? I'll tell you, growing up, me and my friend across the street, George Collins, we grew up playing war, and our enemy was the Russians. We were going to beat the Russians, or the Soviets, I guess is what we knew them back then. That was our biggest enemy. My son grew up in the last few years, all he could think about was the country's going to go dissolve and it's going to be in civil war. Why are kids thinking that? It's a different world today. It is not the same world we grew up in. People around us are more educated and they're wealthier. We have access to instant information far more than we can process. We've grown impatient. We've grown selfish. We've grown to be arrogant. We think we know more than we do. And you look around our communities are different too. Now, Christianity is just one of many different types of religions in our communities. In some places, it feels that Christians may be part of a growing minority, especially if you're intent on applying Christian or biblical values to your life. And I understand that this is not the first time in history where something has happened like this, where Christianity is moving toward the minority. But I think it is the first time in this country that Christians find themselves living in times of active resistance to and the wholesale rejection of our religion by society at large. That is a first in the existence of our country. Many of the values that we took for granted just a few short decades ago now are being lost to the passage of time. And today our children are going to public school. They're being confronted with immorality on a scale that we could never have imagined when we were children. They're being trained to question authority. They're being trained to question biblical values, and they are being shamed into thinking that those who espouse Christian morality have dark hearts and are nothing more than racist bigots or nationalists who have just mad because their time of exclusivity is over. That's what they're being trained. And so this is having an impact on the church. It really is. Today, a typical congregation in the Church of Christ will lose half of its young people to the world once they leave home. I've seen this spell out in my own existence over the last 18 years as a gospel preacher, working for 2 large suburban congregations in the Midwest. It's hovering around 60% of the young people that I have seen grow up over the last 20 years in those 2 congregations have walked away from the Lord. At younger and younger issues, our young people are facing issues on the existence of God, on the validity and authority of Scripture. They're facing issues on sexual morality, gender issues, the legalization of drugs, and cohabitation. And as we observe the world around, it feels as if young minds are not only being swayed by these things, but they are now being fundamentally and permanently changed. And so the question really comes down to this: how are we going to respond? As a church, how will we respond? How is the church going to engage the culture? The culture has changed. I'll tell you, it's a critical moment in our existence. Because if we do not find the answers, if we do not respond in the right way, a generation from now, we may be looking at empty buildings and wondering how we got here. And so it's critical. We've got to respond in the right way, and we've got to do it now. So the question really is how do we do that? Well, I think one of the things we've got to realize is that we have a new reality that has come upon us. It's just a fact. It's a different world. Christian influence in many places in the United States is no longer the majority influence. And I'll tell you, when you come to grips with that, it is going to impact you emotionally. In fact, you may feel a sense of shock and awe. You may start feeling anxious about the future. You may watch the papers or read the papers or watch television and not be sure how you're going to respond. And I think it is all very easy for us to say that we are responding to this with many different types of emotions, much like I think is what's described in the 3 stages of grief. We're dealing with this in a very similar way, because as we're coping with changing moral standards and the rejection of Christianity, one of the things that we may go through first is basically shock and denial. And maybe you're in that stage right now. Some of the things that we see and that we read and that we watch are just absolutely shocking. I mean, you watch commercials lately? One of the things my wife has done over the last few months is I'll come home in the afternoons and Andy Griffith is what's on, because it's on about 3 or 4 hours on TV Land every afternoon. And she is watching that when I come home, usually from the office. And that's fine. That's great. That's good TV, right? You ever watch some of the commercials during that? It just blow you away. It's blatant immorality out there on advertisement. It's being encouraged. It's shocking. We don't know how to respond. And as you look ahead to the future, maybe your heart is filled with fear and anxiety. And really, what happens to me is I want to hold on to a reality that no longer exists. My thought goes back to my childhood when times were simpler, and I want to dwell on that, and really I want to emotionally reject what is going on right in front of me. And so I ignore the problem. You know why Becky's watching Andy Griffith? Because much of the stuff that's on the other channels that we have is just not fit to watch. So we ignore the problem, we turn off the TV, we get off social media, we just disconnect, and we try to convince ourselves that the change won't have any impact on us, and we're going to just carry on just like we always have. It's shock and denial. Sometimes that turns into anger and depression. Things in this stage progress to where we can no longer ignore it, so we decide to fight back against our fear. And this is why I think our social media feeds are the way they are. How many are on Facebook? Come on, it's okay. You can raise your hand. Is your Facebook feed a source of encouragement or discouragement? What do you normally see on there? A lot of it's discouraging. I mean, bring up the vaccine. Bring up Biden. Bring up anything that's political. And watch how people react. And what is happening, at least on my Facebook feed, is people are blaming it on ideology, They go to stereotypes. They lash out at people they disagree with. I mean, just the newspapers will post articles. You ever want to have a waste of time? Newspaper posts an article and then there's comments below. Just go read those comments sometime. If you're really into wasting time, that's what you should do. But it'll just get you going. And people are expressing their anger on social media, of which, by the way, if you've gotten drawn into that and you're expressing your anger on social media, guess what? There's not one person you've ever changed their mind with your thoughts. Not one. Because we're going to stick it to those that we disagree with. We're going to let them know how we feel. We're largely suspicious. We're skeptical. We reveal our frustration, and lower we sink until we begin to believe there's no hope, there's no possibility of change. We feel overwhelmed. We get isolated. We talk about moving other places. I've heard so many people, discussions. I'm going to move out of the country. What country could we move to? I'm going to move to Wyoming and get out in the wide open spaces and get away from this. I'm hearing people talk about this more and more and more. Anger and depression is part of the way we cope with this. And really, the third stage that we may have to get to is one of acceptance and integration. This is where we finally come to terms and accept things for the way that they are. And we must admit, brothers and sisters, that after 45 years, we need to be able to admit that we have probably lost a culture war. We really need to understand that. We've lost it. We have lost the culture war. And it's okay to admit that. It's okay to do that. We need to be able to move on from that and accept that and understand that what's going on and work inside the change that is happening instead of working against it. But in this stage, we're beginning to look for new opportunities. We're beginning to move in faith and hope and trust. And so this is how we react to what's going on. So now the question really comes for us, how am I going to live inside this culture? How am I going to live inside this new reality that we face? So let's talk about culture for a few moments. What do we mean when we use that term, culture? Now, a lot of people use different terms to describe culture or bring that to reality. So, for example, some people use the word culture to describe arts and classical music. Some people use culture to describe pop culture, that is TV shows and movies and music and reality TV. Some people use the word culture to describe worldliness. They'll use it to describe all the things that they're against, like immoral lifestyles or liberal politics or social agendas. What do we mean when we use the term culture? Well, I want to give you two definitions. Stone Street and Kunkel, in their book, describe culture as what people do with the world. So that's an interesting definition. What people do with the world, how they live in it, how they react to it, the things they produce. And going along with that, Bruce Ashford defines culture as any things humans produce when they interact with each other in God's creation. So, broadly speaking, culture, when we talk about that, it embraces the totality of life in this world. And culture is something that's constantly changing. And culture has a way of repeating itself. Things go in and out of style. How many of you lived through the 70s? It was a great decade, I think. I kind of remember the 70s. Bell bottoms, leisure suits. Remember all that stuff? How many of you still got some of that in your closet? It's coming back. That's what happens with culture. Things go in and out of style. When I was growing up in the late 80s, the 50s were coming back. All right, remember the tight jeans, you'd roll them up at the bottom and all that? That was a big deal in the late 80s. Things have a way of repeating themselves. Things go in a style, things go out of style. The way we use language changes. So culture is something that's dynamic. What one generation considers normal, the next generation thinks it's odd or different. So Cornerstone has had a young guy as the second preacher. And a few months ago, he walks in my office, and I had a new sweater on. And the first thing he says when he walks in my office is, "You look fresh." What? I am not fresh. But he meant it as a compliment, and I'm sitting there going, what? It's a generational thing. The use of words change. So think about this. Culture is something that is perpetuated by influencers. So we have a lot of influencers in our society today. You think about songwriters and actors and artists. Basically, those are storytellers. And they express themselves in books that we read, on TV shows that we watch, movies, documentaries, etc., etc. But songwriters and artists are big influencers in our culture. Think about entrepreneurs and the way they market things to us. And think about multi-billion-dollar corporations and the commercials and the branding that they have and how they impact us and try to influence us to buy their products. They are certainly influences in the culture. Educators are influencers, be it in secondary and post-secondary institutions. The government is an influencer. Media is an influencer. Family is an influencer. And finally, the church. So I just went through a list. 7 things. Songwriters, entrepreneurs, educators, government, media, family, and the church. Now I want to ask you a question. Which of those influencers have become of lesser importance over your lifetime? Family is down toward the bottom of the list now, and the church. Things are changing. We need to understand it. So the question then is, well, how do I relate to the culture? What should be my perspective in how I'm looking at the future and how I interact with those that are out in the world? Well, there's 2 ways that we can go about this. One is where we go against the culture. And this is the idea of what Ashford calls Christians against culture. And in his book on culture, Bruce Ashford talks about this as viewing the church as like a bomb shelter. And the idea here is that the church becomes a place where we can withdraw from the culture at large. It becomes a safe haven, a safe place. We can come in here inside these 4 walls. We can be protected from everything that's going on outside that we disagree with. And this is where we're going to just huddle up. Now, I think there are some good motives behind it and some well-minded intentions. And there are some biblical principles here as well, because Christians have been called to be pure and holy. We are to protect ourselves against ungodly influences. Think of this passage here in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 14. Notice here, we are expected to lead holy lives. And notice the admonition here at the end of the verse. If you're not leading a holy life, you will not see the Lord. Without holiness, you will not see the Lord. So if I'm going out here and indulging in the world's pleasures and the filthiness that's out there, I will not see the Lord. So I need to be in a place where I'm protected from that. Notice this passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1, where we are told to cleanse ourselves from every impurity of flesh and spirit and bring holiness to completion in the fear of God. And then Peter writes here in 1 Peter chapter 1, do not be conformed to the desires of your former ignorance. Notice the command here, be holy in all your conducts, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. So, the idea to have the church as a place of protection is biblical. And it is very true that the church should be that, a place of refuge, a place of protection, a place to come where people can be healed spiritually, renewed, and refreshed. But brothers and sisters, I want to tell you this afternoon that the battle is not going on inside of our church buildings. The battle is out in the world. And we must never retreat inside our buildings and wait for the world to end. More than ever, the battle is raging on the outside, and we need to see ourselves as the vessels that transmit the power of Jesus to change hearts and minds. We have been given that mission. We've been called on to be interacting with people out in the world and lead them to Christ. I want you to look at a passage with me from the Gospel of John. This is John 17. This is verses 14 through 16. And I want you to read this with me for just a moment or two and let it soak in. This is the night before Jesus dies. This is part of his high priestly prayer. What does he pray? Listen, my dad passed away about 8 years ago. Here in about 3 weeks, it'll be 8 years. And the last week, as he went into hospice, he and I had some conversations. I'll tell you, you listen to those conversations and you remember them. Because the words that a man is speaking in the hours leading up to his death are some of the most important he will ever speak. And here is Jesus. And I want you to see what he's praying for here. He says, I have given them your word. The world hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I am not praying that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. So what I pull out of those 3 verses, 2 things. First, we are in the world, but we are not of it. All right? He has changed our address, so to speak. But one of the things I want you to see here as you think about this passage is isolation is not an option. Nowhere has the Lord called us to have a small group out in some isolated area where we just park ourselves and wait on his return. He says, you're in the world but not of it. And notice here, I can't remove myself from it. And so Christianity is not all about militant resistance. And if I'm going to frame Christianity as being against the culture, then I'm going to primarily view everything from the perspective of warfare. And yes, I understand we are at war with Satan. Timothy was told to fight the good fight of faith. But brothers and sisters, spiritual warfare is not the totality of my existence. I need to be able to look out and see the world and see it from the perspective that there are lost people in the world who are in need of rescue. That's the way I need to look at the world. We have been left here to help people. And like Jesus, we need to have a heart for the lost and be willing to exhibit the love of the Father. So we need not be against the culture as much as we need to move from the perspective of understanding we are living in the culture and we are for the culture. Now I want to take you back to John 17. And I want you to reread these verses that are here on the screen. And I want you to see as you read these that this is the essence of what it means to be in and for the culture. You see, we don't withdraw. We don't just surrender to a life of fear and isolation. The idea here is that we engage where we can. We view ourselves as representatives of Christ who live for the good of others. And we accomplish this by keeping in step with the Spirit and thereby bring glory to Jesus Christ by providing effective testimony for the gospel. Listen, all around us, what do we see? We see people that are worshiping themselves. We see people worshiping sex or money or power or anything other than God. And it is our job to speak out against these things, but to speak out against these things from the perspective of wanting to provide help. This is what I mean by living for the culture. We are speaking out for their sake. We are speaking out to help them. We are there to show people how to direct their lives. We are bringing solutions, not condemnation and not judgment. Now that's the message of Jesus. So when you go back and look through the Gospels, look for example, Matthew 5:13. That is Jesus' point when he talks about you are the salt of the earth. What does salt do? It preserves everything that is good and right and wholesome. That's our mission. We're not out there just shooting bullets all the time, shooting people down and bringing condemnation and judgment. Yes, we need to be able to stand up and say, look, there are things that are not right. We need to be able to do that. But it's the spirit with which we go about it. Notice verse 14, you are the light of the world. Light always acts in a way that points to its source. We are living to show people the way out of their sin, to show them the way out of their immorality, to show them out of the way that they've gone, and point them toward God. That is what it means to be in and for the culture. Look, it is easy. How many of you agree with this? It's easier to be negative than positive. Would you agree with that? So default mode may be for us to just always think, man, this is wrong, that's wrong, it's not the way it used to be. Life is headed off the trail. We're never coming back. The country's lost. It's all going to be over. And we can just get ourselves all worked up, and it shows because we've reflected in the way we've handled ourselves around people. I talked about in the beginning of the lesson, the first lesson this morning, all the frustrating things that are going on around us right now. Nobody wants to work. Prices are high. There's uncertainty everywhere. No leadership. Politics is just a mess. And then you have people acting out in all sorts of crazy ways. Saying things they don't need to be saying, responding to this, that way. I mean, it's awful. We've got to resist that, brothers and sisters, and remember to operate from the perspective of being there to provide solutions. Now, I want to take you to 2 Corinthians as we start winding up the lesson here. What is our directive in responding to the culture? I think the directive is pretty simple here as we look at 2 Corinthians 5, starting in verse 17. The idea that's presented here is that we go forward with a ministry of reconciliation. And so here is verse 17. And it really begins with my own understanding of who I am. We've been given a new identity. Do you see it here in this verse? If anyone is in Christ, he or she is what? A new creation. That's our identity. That's who we are. We need to move from that perspective. That really is the baseline that drives everything else in our life. We are a new creation. Our newness, notice this verse, our newness responds, it is being directed because of our relationship of being in Christ. If anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creation. That's where we begin. And when I get that, and I understand I'm a new creation, a new person, new identity, a new place of residence as far as where I'm headed, I'm a citizen of heaven now. And I want everybody else to go with me. Then we look at verses 18 and 19. Because I'm a new creation, God has given me and you and every Christian a mission. And Paul spells it out here in this verse very clearly. He says, God has reconciled us to himself through Christ, and he has given us the what? Ministry of reconciliation. What is that? What is Paul saying in verse 18? He is saying God wants to reconcile sinners to himself through Christ. And if you move on to verse 19 here, upon our reconciliation, God has committed the mission of reconciliation to who? Us. He has committed the message of reconciliation to us. What is the message of reconciliation? That Jesus Christ is Lord and that he came to die on the cross for sinners to bring the world and reunite the world with God. That's the gospel. That's the message. And so as you look at this verse, what I want you to see is my focus needs to be outward, toward the lost. I mean, we're talking about real, tangible, practical service. Being involved in our communities. How much does the community of Wheelersburg know that you exist? If you were to stand at Walmart, I don't know how far Walmart is from here. I don't know, a mile or two, right? And you're just to say, this afternoon I'm going to go park myself at the exit door of Walmart and talk to people as they walk out the front entrance. And I'm going to ask them, hey, have you ever heard of Wheelersburg Church of Christ? Do you know who we are? How many people would you expect to answer, yeah, I know that church? How much are we involved in our communities? How much are we impacting the lost? That's the question for us. Our focus needs to be outward, toward the lost, service-based. Look at the next part here in verse 19. We've been given a message. Notice here, the message of reconciliation. What is the message? Did you know that word message there? If you dig down into the original language, that's the word for the gospel. It's the word, it's talking about the message of who Jesus is and why he came to this earth and what he provided through his sacrificial death on the cross. That is the gospel. We've been given that message, and the message is to go out to every person that we can get it to. It's the mission of every Christian. Not just the preacher, not just the shepherds, not just the deacons, not just the influential people in the church. Every member, every Christian has been given this message of reconciliation. This is why Paul says what he does in verse 20. And he uses the imagery of an ambassador here. And that's what he's saying. We are ambassadors. Listen, what is an ambassador? If you were an ambassador of the United States, where would you want to go? Let me just ask you that. I'll tell you where I want to go. Italy. That's right. Rome. That would be cool. I've never been to Italy. I can tell you I've been to Ukraine, and I just really wouldn't want to be an ambassador to Ukraine. I've been to Colombia. Don't think I'd mind that so much. I like coffee. And you can get a lot of coffee there, good coffee. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But imagine if you were the ambassador to Italy, or pick your favorite country, Switzerland, I don't know, New Zealand, whatever, Mexico, whatever. You know, if you occupied that office at the behest of the president, you would be in a place of honor. You'd be occupying a place of dignity where basically what you're doing is you're representing the government in a foreign land. That's what an ambassador does. And Paul is drawing on that analogy here in 2 Corinthians 5:20. And think about this. Throughout the New Testament, the apostles often focus on the fact that we are citizens dwelling in a foreign land because this world is not our home. But while we are here, what is our job? We are proclaiming the message of reconciliation, representing our King, King Jesus. And so each of us have been charged to carry the words that have been given to us. We speak by Jesus through the revealed word. And I want you to understand, as we speak about Jesus, and that's just our mission. The mission of reconciliation here is we speak about Jesus, who he is, we represent him. It is not our job to change the culture. We've never been called to change the culture. Look, as we move in and for the culture, we're going to encounter people who are in need of rescue. We're going to get to know people that are unbelievers. More and more. What is the fastest growing religion in this country? Do you know? Right now, 2021, what is the fastest growing religious category in this country? It's the nuns. You know what that is? It's not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S. The nuns. People who no longer believe in God or have no religious affiliation whatsoever. More and more people are headed that direction. Secularism is where we're headed. We're going to get to know people like that. We're going to have to know, look, answers to questions that we used to take for granted. Next summer at Cornerstone, we're going to be talking about tough questions. How do we know there's a God? How do we know that the Bible is real? We're going to be answering some of those questions because those questions Christians can no longer take for granted. They need to have the answers to those questions because people are asking them. We're going to encounter people trapped in pornography. We're going to encounter people struggling with same-sex addiction. We're going to deal with people who had multiple abortions or people questioning their gender. We're going to deal with broken people in general. And the question before us is, are we prepared to respond to that? If somebody came up to you today and asked, I'm really struggling with my gender identity and I don't know what to do about this, how would you answer that? Are we prepared? And I'm not talking about just being dismissive and say, well, you just need to deal with it. is you just put a wall up. We've got to have legitimate, well thought out answers on those types of questions, because they're going to be coming more and more and more. Look, I preach 86 miles from here in the Midwest. And we had earlier this summer a young family come to us, brought their teen kids, and one of the teen kids brought a person who has she is a homosexual, and she brought her transgender friend to Bible class. And tell you, we were talking, we tried to be very friendly and all of that, but I'm telling you, we're going to be confronted with that more and more and more. And the question is, how are we going to respond to lifestyles that in our mind may be personally revolting, but we've got to present the gospel. We've got to present Jesus in a way that will reach them, not put up walls. That's our challenge. And look, I don't have all the answers. But that's the world we're living in. And so when we speak of the message of reconciliation, we need to let them know that we love them and that there is a way out of their sin, and that with Jesus comes forgiveness, and that forgiveness is always there. We speak to these individuals with a spirit of care and love and concern. That is what we've got to do. You know, I'll just tell you this. I mentioned a moment ago, it's not our job to change the culture. Now, I'm 47, so my life remembrance goes back to the late 70s at its furthest. But I have read and been educated a little bit. You remember the mid to late 70s, something called the moral majority. Do you remember that? Led by prominent evangelicals, Jerry Falwell. There's a guy who focused the family who I cannot remember his name at the moment. It's going to bug me now. But anyway, you know who I'm talking about. I'm sure you do. But you just have in your mind certain pictures of individuals over the last 40 years. And what were we told? Well, we're going to elect people that are going to produce a moral agenda. And that's going to save the country. I mean, that's really what we've been told. So think about it. There's all these organizations over the last 40 years that, you know, for example, in every presidential election over the last 12 or 16 years, there have been organizations in our community that have sent these sheets with check boxes. And they have a comparison between this candidate and that candidate, and they have various issues, and this candidate believes this, and this candidate believes that, and blah, 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 blah. And down by the bottom says, this is who you need to vote for. Are you familiar with anything like that? And they want churches to get this information out. They'll mail it to us. Brothers and sisters, is the legislation of morality, has that worked? I think about it. Be objective over the last 40 years. And by the way, do the politicians really care about us? Oh, every 4 years, I mean, we're coming into a midterm next year. Ohio's got several races. It'll be national races. And what are the politicians going to tell us? Oh, we care about abortion. We care about morality. We care about all these things. Let me tell you how many times over the last 40 years we've had Republicans who've asked, they court the moral majority. They court evangelicals. What do they tell us? Oh, we're going to pass this law that's going to outlaw abortion, or outlaw abortion. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. You know, just vote for me. Just give me all this money, right? Now, how many times have they had the House and the Senate and the presidency at the same time, and what's happened? Nothing. Nothing. In fact, dare I say, the culture's gotten worse. So for all of us who are caught up in politics and we're thinking that the next presidential candidate, the orange-haired man, we think he's got it and he's going to save us, you're putting your trust in the wrong place. You're putting your emphasis in the wrong place. The emphasis is on Jesus. He's the only one that can change hearts and minds. He's the only one that can change the culture. Through His Word, through His power. Not in the person that occupies the Oval Office, not in the person that occupies the Senate or the House or the governor of Ohio or whoever it is. The power is in Jesus Christ. May we understand that. Some of us got too sidetracked on politics, and it has damaged our influence for Christ. We need to understand that. Now, I'll get off my soapbox. How many of you remember April 20th, 1999? Oh, yes. I remember. Well, I can tell you I remember it very well. I can tell you where I was that day as I listened to the news reports coming in. It was the day of the Columbine shooting. We were out in northern Wyoming that day. We'd been to Yellowstone, and we lived in South Dakota at the time. We were driving back to the Black Hills, and I just remember that night as we were driving back across, listening to KOA out of Denver, and all the reports coming in, and every half hour the news would come on, and we were in the vehicle with friends, preaching friends, and we hung on every word of every news report, and we tried to comprehend everything that was going on that day. Couldn't believe it. And I don't know if you remember this, but it seems to me that for weeks afterward, the country was just in shock. We could not fathom the fact that two young men would walk into a school and just start blowing people away. And now here we are 22 years later, and I think our country has become numb to mass shootings. I mean, we had one in Dayton, 2 years ago? 8 people, 9 people shot and killed. And you know what happens every time that does? The press goes all in a frenzy, and we start trying to look for people to blame and all this kind of stuff. The president comes to town and makes everybody feel better. And then guess what? A week or two later, everybody goes back to normal life. And then it happens again, and the cycle just repeats. We've come numb to it. But I read this a few years after the Columbine shooting. This was in the early double O's. What do you call that decade? The double O's, the aughts? I don't know. Anyway, it was in the early 2000s. A man walked into a one-room Amish schoolhouse in Pennsylvania and murdered 5 young girls between the age of 6 and 13. And then he killed himself. And how that Amish community just out of Lancaster, PA handled it is amazing. And I think we need to take note of it. In the aftermath of that shooting, the parents of the deceased girls reached out to the shooter, the parents of the shooter, the mother of the shooter, and prayed for her. The day of the shooting, an Amish man literally held the father of the shooter in his arms while he grieved. And when it came time for the funeral of the shooter, 30 people from the community, the Amish community, people whose daughters had been killed, came to the funeral and set up a charitable foundation for his family because this shooter had left behind a wife and 3 kids. One Amish woman said, quote, "We can tell people about Christ and actually show you in our walk that we are forgiving. Not just say it, but we show it in our walk of life. You know, you have to live it. You can't just say it." I tell you, I have theological disagreements with our Amish friends, but they stand out as a beacon of hope, a beacon of light in the way they displayed love and grace in a very awful situation, and dare I say it was Christianity in action. That is the ministry of reconciliation. That is service. Brothers and sisters, we offer solutions. We don't build walls. We offer open arms. we don't make enemies. We live in and for the culture. That's our challenge. So as we close our lesson time together this morning, I want to ask you this very simple question. Do you know the Lord? We're asking you if you have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I feel confident if you are a guest here today and you're looking for Jesus, maybe you've come in and you're searching, I want you to know that there is hope. There is an opportunity to find peace. There is a way to walk away from the old things in your life that have brought you so much trouble, and to find that peace and to find that reconciliation and to change your spiritual address, so to speak, to becoming a citizen of heaven, looking forward with hope to a world that is better, the world that is eternal, a world that is permanent. We want to help you find that today. Discover it. Jesus said, turn away from your old life. Walk away, because if you don't, you're going to perish. Jesus said, confess me as your Lord. And the one that confesses me as Lord, I will confess before my Father who is in heaven. And Jesus said in Mark 16, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. And the question is this morning, will you follow through and put him on? Dying to yourself today, or rising with him in the waters of baptism to a new creation. All things are ready. We'd love to help you do that. If you need to come forward, why don't you do something as we stand and sing.